What we're seeing is the emergence of a form of populism which potentially could move into something like fascism.
I think they're contemptuous of us. I think they think we're irrelevant. I don't think they're remotely enthused or inspired by politicians anymore.
We call ourselves a democracy, but it doesn't take too much scrutiny, really.
Good government is difficult. Perfect government is impossible. If we want saints to run this country, we have to wait for the second coming. Until then, we have to accept that the laws of cock-up are much more prevalent than the laws of conspiracy.
We're coming to the end of the noughties, one of the most violent decades we've known since the conflicts of the World War, both World Wars, the Cold War. We've seen 9/11. We've seen the London bus and tube bombings. We've seen hundreds of thousands of probably pointless deaths. We saw the invasion of Iraq by the West, the downfall of Saddam, escalating military conflict right across the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine. It goes on and on. But the last 10 years have seen a big change in the way our democracy works and in the public's relations with politics and politicians. So where does the big threat come to our cherished democracy? Is it terrorism that's to blame? Or is it the public's alienation from politics and politicians, caused possibly by those politicians' inability to face unpalatable truths? The million or so British people who marched through London 9 years ago against the Iraqi invasion and were ignored would undoubtedly point to one great political lie as the foundation stone for the Iraqi invasion. Meanwhile, British politics has turned sour. The vast majority of voters in this country believe that they've been conned by the British MPs who've been riding a gravy train of ill-gotten gains, unfounded expenses claims, which have shocked and outraged the British public. Fictional mortgages, expensive claims for building duck houses and cleaning moats around stately homes, exorbitant bills for second dwellings, all of it borne by an increasingly unwilling taxpayer. That's what gets people mad. When it comes to fiddling expenses or fighting wars, it seems that the British MP just doesn't get it. And worse, the public is beginning to believe that he's telling them lies.
I certainly don't trust him. Ordinary people don't trust him. Young people, any young person now who joins the Labour Party, I really don't have time for or trust, because the Labour Party that we know of our youth, of our growing up, is a party of privatisation, of attacks on the working class, of bloody massacres and wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and this is of corruption, of bailing out bankers and putting students in debt. This is what mainstream politics to us is, and anyone who is getting involved in that now, I think, is an opportunist and a careerist.
We've got a crisis on every level in our society at the moment. We've got economic collapse, ecological collapse. We've recognised that this isn't working, and now we're just looking at ways to make it better.
Politicians are too tied to corporations, they're too tied to business, and they're placing profit and accumulation above needs of people and the needs of the planet.
They've failed us on so many levels. It goes wrong when people think they can represent a whole demographic of society with knowing nothing about them.
So we've come here to what boasts of being the mother of parliaments to ask the people in there what's gone wrong.
Well, I suppose if they told the truth all the time, they'd never be elected. But does a man tell his wife the truth all the time? I mean, if you don't particularly want to go to something that she's desperate to go to, you often just put a smile and say, yeah, let's go.
The last 10 years in particular has seen an obfuscation of honesty.
Politicians lie because they are frightened of the truth. They believe if the truth is told, somehow it will be damaging to them.
The most obvious misinformation
was Tony Blair in the lead up to the war in Iraq.
Tony Blair did not lie in the run-up to the Iraq vote. That is one of the biggest cliches of 20th century politics. He did not lie.
Iraq and the lies that went into it really left a kind of mood of contempt. Because if you can lie about that, what else can't be lied about?
It's not that they're liars, but they feel uncomfortable moving away from the group spirit, the party line. Maybe there is an extent to which that is based on personal ambition, but the collective effect of that, of course, is that people end up being just a little bit more opportunistic than they might actually need to be.
Somebody said that politicians are actually creative psychopaths, and creative psychopaths is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, the problem is none of us can ever be ourselves. We have to reflect the prejudices, the concerns, the worries of our constituents. So a lot of us end up looking like our constituencies. In fact, some of us look as though we've eaten our constituencies. So it's incredibly difficult because everybody, and I've got 80,000 on my patch, 80,000 people in my constituency, every one of them expects me to be a person who reflects their own interests, concerns and prejudices. So we spend a lot of time pretending to be things that we're not. And a lot of time amongst ourselves admitting to each other what we really are, which is why most of us are, frankly, profoundly schizophrenic.
They're given the line to take, they get their briefing notes, they get the phrases to use, they're given answers to the questions they might be asked to make sure they don't deviate from the government line or from the opposition line.
There are some who delude themselves that, contrary to all the evidence, they're telling the truth. They believe their own press releases. Perhaps Tony Blair was one of those. He actually believed he was doing the right thing. Maybe he did do that. He clearly wasn't. And he had to turn logic on its head to reach that conclusion. But maybe he did do that. Maybe that's how people like that reconcile themselves to the positions they take. They persuade themselves they're doing the right thing.
But surely our idealistic young MPs, they come to Parliament for the right reason, don't they? They come here to change the world.
They want to give some service to the people who vote for them and their country, and they do want to make the world a better place.
I never met anybody who came into politics without an element of idealism, and genuinely. I mean, trust me, I'm a politician. Everybody has that, because if you don't feel you can change things and make things a little bit better, then frankly, you're not going to survive for 2 minutes in politics.
I think most politicians are in it for the right reasons, and one of the things that angers me is that I think the overwhelming majority of politicians are straightforward and honest, and they have been tainted with the goings-on of a few.
You'll find people who are courageous, you'll find people who are cowards, you'll find people who are intrinsically good, you'll find people intrinsically out for themselves. You know, and you'll find that in a company, you'll find it in an NGO, you'll find it in office politics. You know, we're no different.
Most of them have achieved little or nothing in the real world before going into politics. They're there at the behest of their parties. They toe the line. They traipse through the lobby on the three-line whip and do what their party tells them virtually every single time. We really have got a very poor crop of politicians.
I think some MPs have got the backbone of a chocolate eclair.
A lot of politicians go into politics for just the right reasons, i.e. they want to make the world a better place, they want to serve their country. Unfortunately, something very odd happens to politicians at all kinds of levels when they enter politics, and they start to behave in a sectional or a factional interest. They start to behave for reasons of private greed rather than public good, and something goes horribly wrong.
What I think happens sometimes is that MPs who do get elected get attracted by the profession of politics, and sometimes that doesn't corrupt them, but it corrodes their purism, their idealism, and then they might cut a few corners. But that doesn't make them bad people. It simply means that sometimes they might be a little bit more economical with the very clear-cut positions they had when they first got elected.
So what about that Foreign Secretary of ours, David Miliband? What turned an idealistic young man like him into someone who feels he can defend torture?
Well, let's look at the issue, say, of David Miliband, who I'm sure who's now Foreign Secretary, and entered politics because he genuinely believed that he was idealistic, I think. He wanted to make the world a better place. He had very strong values of human rights and so forth. And yet, now that he's Foreign Secretary, he's come into connection with the security establishment. He now defends, or he's now implicated in Britain's complicity with torture. And he's now putting out barricades against finding out the truth about Britain's implication in torture. Now, how does that happen? It happens because he's become in contact with the United States of America, much bigger interests than he probably even understood existed when he entered politics as a naive young man.
If, say, David Miliband said, I want to tell the truth about MI5 and MI6 and their involvement in the torture of British citizens who'd been extradited illegally, usually by the CIA, the senior civil servants in the Foreign Office would go straight to the Prime Minister and he'd be told, you do that, you're out. And so, this sweet young boy I used to know when he was a teenager, worked in my outer office in his school holidays, has made himself the torturer's apprentice, basically. Your lawyers are never allowed that one on.
Well, you come in with your ideas and your ideals, and you keep your core beliefs, but you change because of the environment you operate in. Fish can only swim in the sea. Politicians can only operate in the political world. And the political world over there is a cross between a boys' public school and a sort of 18th century magistrates' court. So there's still a lot of that nonsense, that flummery around it. But it's also intensely seductive.
I think you can keep your principles. You can walk with kings and keep your virtue, but it's difficult.
When you become an MP, it's a life-changing experience. You are in a situation where you're surrounded by quite powerful people. Some of the people you're surrounded by are also very rich and quite powerful in their own right. And it's quite easy to be seduced into believing that you're a very powerful and important person, and therefore you should spend your time listening to powerful and important people.
It's quite easy to be absolutely ideologically pure, as long as you never run anything.
Who gets promoted? Frankly, some of the dross who are incapable of annoying anybody because they're incapable of independent thought. Is that who you want in government? Well, that's what we've got far too often.
Back in 2003, I voted against the government on the war in Iraq. And a lot of people said to me, actually, perhaps you would have been a minister much, much quicker if you had voted differently on Iraq.
Well, you become cynical. You begin to rationalise your actions. It's very easy. You also have power, and power is very seductive.
What they really have to do is compromise with reality.
So they do tell lies, and for a variety of reasons. But are they the only ones? What about the media? If you want to get a politician really mad, just mention the media.
This country isn't really being led down by politicians so much as the media.
You want us to say something stupid, because if we don't say something stupid, you haven't got nearly as good a story as if we did say something stupid.
The media see an interview not as a way of finding out what somebody thinks, but to put them on trial for their life.
It will be Tories to abandon NHS, NHS to be dismantled, NHS to be privatised. Complete distortion of what the politicians actually saying. And it really is time the press and media woke up. They want to sell newspapers, they want drama, they don't want boring headlines. But they must wake up to what this is doing to national debate.
The press have got freedom and they abuse it. And so, as well as the mistakes that we genuinely do make here, the press has been completely biased in trying to make us all look like, well, like shit, basically.
Dogs get fleas, politicians get journalists.
The media is more powerful than any 30, 40, 50, 100 backbench MPs, yes, without a doubt. Much more powerful now than the MPs themselves. And sadly, most of it is right-wing.
I know newspapers which print things they know to be untrue, don't you?
So is it all the fault of the media? Is it my fault? After all, I'm a former editor of the Daily Mirror. Maybe we chase our politicians too hard. Maybe they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't.
Politicians are reacting to a stereotype which has been successfully promulgated overwhelmingly by the media of having the politician who is inoffensive to the largest number of people. And we've swallowed it. We haven't had the courage or the intellectual strength to actually break that mould and go over that and say, well, actually, no, we're not going to be absolutely middle-of-the-road soft rock. Occasionally there's going to be a bit of an acid house garage or funk or something mixed in there with it.
The game of politics has changed. Ideological differences have given way to a battle for that strategic soft centre, the narrow middle ground, which ignores the views of people to the left or to the right.
To take an obvious example, you have a Labour government doing privatisations. So of course people scratch their heads and they say, what's the difference? Why go out on a wet Thursday for that? You know, where's the difference?
There are minute differences of nuance between them, and they seem to spend millions of pounds at election time playing up what the differences are, when in reality they're very, very small indeed.
Something very, very interesting and fundamental has happened in British politics. That is the collapse of ideological distinctions between our great political parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. That's what Tony Blair was about. He was something called triangulation, a strategy he brought in from the United States, that he consciously went out and adopted right-wing positions on law and order, on the economy, on Europe even, in order to take away ground for strategic purposes, to take away ground from the Tories. And so politics, instead of becoming a battle of ideas, became a sort of strategic battle of territory, where you took ideological positions purely for reasons of tactical convenience. That led to a convergence of the centre of British public life.
They've tried to eliminate the differences. They've become managerial parties, particularly Labour Party, in the middle of the political spectrum, because it's safe to do so, because their pollsters tell them the votes are in the middle, not at the extremes. So they move towards a centre being guided by the pollsters and by the focus groups rather than any deep-seated philosophy.
There's something to be said for real policy differences between the government and the opposition, but it's not actually essential, because if a country's in an era when there is a real consensus about the main issues of economic strategy and public spending and so on, you are basically making a choice as to which team do you want. It's rather like saying, do Tesco and Sainsbury's have to be radically different? No, they don't.
Tories, New Labour, the Liberal Democrats, you couldn't get a cigarette paper between them.
For an example of that, we need look no further than a packed House of Commons in 2007.
I am truly sorry about the dangers that they face today in Iraq and Afghanistan. I know some may think that they face these dangers in vain. I don't, and I never will. I believe they are fighting for the security of this country and the wider world against people who would destroy our way of life.
So, a Labour Prime Minister says farewell. He wasn't Winston Churchill. He didn't win any world wars. He actually took us into an unpopular one.
And I wish everyone, friend or foe, well, and that is that, the end.
Yet he gets a standing ovation, not just from his own back benches, but from the massed ranks of the opposition benches, led by his supposed nemesis, David Cameron. What does that make Tony Blair? The best Prime Minister the Tories never had?
Even if the gap's only 6 inches between the parties, that's 6 inches that's worth living in.
There is a problem about where we are now, where you have this tiny area of centre ground fought over really viciously by the main political parties. It can't last because it excludes from debate the vast majority of the British people.
This is what turns people off politics.
I don't think they are too similar. I think if the Tories get in, people will realise there's still a very big difference. I think it's going to be very unpleasant very quickly. But certainly they've become far too close.
Don't you understand that there are many and varied reasons why people vote Labour and some vote against? Because we're different. I don't accept what you've just said, but sadly, it is now common currency in the media, and that's one of the reasons why people vote BNP, because they believe what the media are telling them and saying that they're all the same when we're not.
All right, Dennis, old boy, keep your hair on.
In my time, I've seen this ambitious young things come and work for a politician that they think's going somewhere, get taken into ministerial office or into number 10 when that person takes power, get a seat fixed for them, often in a place where they had no roots, hadn't done anything on the ground or with people, very quickly put into ministerial office. I mean, this is, as far as I know, a new phenomenon, or a much bigger phenomenon, because if you look at most of the cabinet, and I think a lot of the shadow cabinet, that's how they arose. And that's a political class. That's people who often played politics as students and then were ambitious to be a politician and haven't done anything real in the world and haven't done much knocking about trying to achieve things and be criticised by people, have to listen to them, but just sort of up the greasy pole very fast and calculatedly.
What did 10 years of Tony Blair leave us with? A presidential system riding roughshod over an enfeebled House of Commons?
Effectively, Britain's an elective dictatorship.
You might want to do something, you might have been elected to do something, and then somebody would say you can't do it. And you said, who gave him the power to tell me what I could do?
Gradually, backbenchers have seen all their rights eroded.
Well, there is debate in the chamber, but are they listened to? No, they're probably not. There's an old saying, if you want to keep a secret, tell the House of Commons.
The Commons just doesn't work as a check on the executive, and all it is a sort of recruiting machine for people to get on the front bench to get to be a minister.
And you and I are being governed by increasing tranches of legislation which have never been debated by Parliament, never mind voted on.
The real issue is the executive versus the legislature, and that's never mentioned. The government is much too centralised, much too powerful.
The real disbenefit is that it's very difficult to get anything done. I mean, too few people are trying to manage the whole state machine.
When you say undemocratic, not sure what that means, because opinion polls tend to like strong leadership. You know, one half of our brain says, isn't that awful? Mrs. Thatcher's bossing everybody about. And the other half of the brain says, well, say what you like about Maggie, she's a leader. So we're all a bit conflicted about this. And, you know, a strong leadership with a mandate, if you've got a majority of 100 and you are the strong leader, then you're entitled to say, I have a mandate to govern. But you better get it right, because the mistakes will be very serious if you don't.
When I was a member of the Cabinet, we had, in January 1968, 8 full-day meetings of the Cabinet, morning and afternoon. And we outvoted the Prime Minister. I was told by the Cabinet Secretary, who was an old official in my department, he said the Cabinet under Blair lasted 20 minutes, long enough for him to tell them what he had decided.
He ran his whole premiership like that. What I say is law was his attitude.
I think they can run Britain from Whitehall and they can't.
But does even the Prime Minister call the shots?
A lot of the power is outside the government. It's with the unelected elements of our society. It's with the press. It's with the Americans who dictate our foreign policy to a large degree. It's with the European Union. It's with the currency speculators. It's with the multinational companies. And yet governments have to tell people that they are in control and they can make a difference. So they pretend to do all sorts of things when actually they haven't got the levers of power in some cases anymore.
It's not always obvious who's pulling the strings. In a country where journalism is shrinking and PR and lobbying are a growth industry, who really gets the ear of the Prime Minister?
In the time I've been in the House of Commons, there's been more and more and more lobbyists. I mean, it's a massive industry now.
There is a big power in lobbying which is almost totally unseen by the public.
You know, here's this argument, put this, and can you come and discuss it with us? Perhaps you can come and join me at Wimbledon, we'll discuss it down there.
It is easier to listen to a lobbyist because a lobbyist is a professional communicator. Your constituents, one's constituents, you never quite know what the constituency is thinking. How could you? I've got about 80,000 voters inside my constituency.
I think those big interests went straight to number 10. I don't think they bother with, but I think the backbenchers listen to the scruffy constituents, and the big commercial interests don't have to bother with that. They go straight for where power lies.
Big corporation can get in to see a minister about something relatively easily.
It is unhealthy, the extent to which certainly both the main parties have increasingly become dependent on the favours of rich men and rich corporations.
Big business big corporate interests play a very large role in governing Britain in an invisible way.
I think the change in the drinking hours was the drinks lobby. But you remember we were all going to be continentals and sip our drinks quietly and no longer have the closing time when people came out and were a bit badly behaved. And I think you can go through it and you can see big commercial lobbies at work.
What about the press barons? I've edited a paper for one of the most famous and powerful, and he never told me what to publish. But the fact is, publishers and press barons put newspapers in a safe pair of hands, editors who know the company line.
People like Murdoch have huge influence, and the public is never aware of just how ruthlessly that is used.
The Murdoch empire is so big, it's unhealthy, and I think a healthy democratic country wouldn't allow concentration of media ownership.
New model political leader negotiates directly with press barons.
Blair, Brown, Cameron care more about what Murdoch thinks than virtually anyone else.
Then there's foreign policy. Does David Miliband really decide what Britain does next?
Well, the government has the power in its own country up to a point. But remember, we now live in a world dominated by, well, the United States, for example.
The sacred, most important thing is to be best friends with the United States of America.
The noughties has been a tumultuous decade. But if the 20th century was an era of democratic improvement for Britain, the new millennium has got off to an inauspicious start. What does the 21st century hold? Maybe it starts with one simple step that only those people over there can take.
A bit of honesty in public life would be a marvellous thing, but who's going to start it?
Someday, one of these highly paid consultants, one of these professionals, one of the people looking at the polling numbers is going to wise up to the fact that the smart thing is to say to your senior politicians, be yourself. It doesn't matter if you say something a little bit off message and create a bit of a flurry for 12 hours or 24 hours, it'll soon die down.
I think the public can tell the real thing when they see it. And they'd rather have people who tell the truth than people who toe the party line. If there's one malaise in this parliament, it's that all the parties love safety. And what we really need is a little bit of danger and a little bit of truth.
I think the important thing if you're a minister is to try to explain the world to people. I think one of the functions in politics is to be a teacher. I'm an untrained classroom assistant to the nation, trying to explain what's happening in order to give people the opportunity to see how they can change it.